On this day, the sky was cloudless, and the sun's rays gently penetrated through the window, reflecting in the dusty panes of the old house. In a room filled with soft light, a middle-aged woman sat in the room, scrutinizing the photos on the shelf. The pictures were memories of vivid moments she had experienced with those who had once been everything to her. She turned the pages in the album and felt her heart fill with warmth and pain at the same time. Here she was, young, full of hopes and dreams, with her husband, with her children, so small and happy, with smiles that now seemed so far away. Here was her oldest son at graduation, here was her daughter at her first pageant, and here was her youngest son, whom she held in her arms, barely holding back tears of happiness. These moments were so far away now, but each photo reminded her how much she had given for her family. Today was her day, her birthday. Her day that had once been full of joy and reunions with loved ones, but was now one of those days she tried to ignore. In her mind, the woman was once again plagued by memories of how many years ago she had waited and hoped her children would be there for her, how they would have fun celebrating the day as they once had as children. Years had passed, however, and things had changed. Each year she felt that emptiness more and more. None of her children called, or came. It was familiar, but it didn't make it any easier. She tried calling several times, but with each minute of waiting, her face grew dimmer and her hands trembled more and more. Silently placing the phone on the table, she looked around again, gazing at the pictures on the walls. They were all part of her past, the time when her house was full of laughter, when the stars in the sky seemed so bright and life itself so beautiful. The woman got up from her chair and walked over to the mirror. In its reflection she saw an old, tired woman with wrinkles on her face, which were like traces of many years of experience. But the look was still the same, full of hope. She fixed her gray hair, feeling no joy, but only a quiet sadness. Like a symbol of some unfulfilled dream, her old mirror reflected not only her face, but also the years that had passed too quickly, leaving her alone. This loneliness was not just physical, but mental as well. For once, when she was young, she could think of the future with joy. Now each year brought more and more loneliness and regret. She looked at her watch again. Time was dragging too slowly. One more hour, one more moment where she waited for someone to walk in, to congratulate her, to say the words that had once sounded so sincere. But it hadn't happened. She sat down on the couch, her eyes beginning to blur with tears, but she held back, not allowing herself to fall into despair. "They'll remember me," she whispered to herself, but the answer was still the same, silence. Her gaze fell on the pictures again. One of them showed her little daughter, radiant and joyful at her first school party. The woman remembered how she had lovingly dressed her, choosing the outfit she thought was the most beautiful. "How much I have done for them," she thought. She had given her best to raise her children, to support them in moments of pain and joy. And now they were adults, busy with their own lives. They were happy, but not with her. It had been years since she had received birthday presents from them, never received those words that seemed so natural and important. Instead, she only occasionally received short messages signed, "with love," but those words no longer had the warmth, the sincerity that she had once given them. They had become so alien, and she found it hard to accept that they were no longer the children she had raised. She tried again that day to maintain some sense of joy, but she couldn't. Sadness overshadowed everything, including her effort. She decided that it was unlikely that anything would change, but she needed at least some sense of being remembered. She stood up, walked over to the table, and picked up a cup of tea, her gaze dwelling on the gift box. She didn't know what was inside, but at that moment she didn't care. It was just a gesture she'd been preparing for a couple weeks ago, hoping that at least this time her children would pick up the phone and congratulate her. Slowly, in the silence of her home, she went back to the picture of her children being little. Those pictures that she loved so much, that were associated with the happiest moments of her life. That moment when they were all around her and she felt needed. But those moments were long gone, like everything else. The woman sat in her chair, staring into the screen of her phone. Her heart beat a little faster when she noticed her son's number pop up on the screen. She jumped up, picking up the phone with trembling hands, but before she could say anything, she heard the same cold and formal phrase. "Hello, Mom, happy birthday. I'm sorry I can't call longer, I'm at work. I'll talk to you later, okay?" And at that moment, her heart squeezed. Words like, "I'll talk to you later," didn't sound like a promise to her, but another excuse. She tried not to show how much it hurt her, but the look in her faded eyes gave it all away. She wasn't offended at her son, but her soul ached at his indifference. "All right," she said quietly, trying not to let her voice waver. "Just remember that I'm always waiting for you." The call cut off. He hadn't said anything unnecessary, and maybe that was even better. The woman put the phone down again, absorbed in its cold silence, and the very emptiness that was becoming more and more apparent in her life appeared before her eyes again. She sat down in her chair again, and without looking at the phone, decided that now would be a good time to call her daughter. Her daughter had always been a little distant, but at least sometimes you could hear a sincere warmth in her voice if she was in a good mood. The woman dialed the number and was about ready to start talking when she heard the very phrase that always made her feel disappointed. "Hello, Mom. Sorry I can't talk, I'm in line at the store," came from the other end. "Congratulations to you, of course. I love you, I hope you're having a good day. We'll be sure to call later as soon as I have a moment." Again, as with her son, there was no mention of a meeting, of any particular concern. The woman felt her gaze growing dimmer and dimmer. Once, many years ago, her children had never missed a chance to wish her a happy birthday, even if only in words, even if simple, they had told her they loved her. Now their every conversation had become a formal procedure, nothing more. And there was nothing alive in it, nothing native. She turned off the phone, plunging the house into silence again. Every time she received such a call, there was an emptiness in her soul that nothing could fill. The calls became more and more infrequent and brief, as if they were becoming mandatory, nothing more. All she dreamed of was just hearing her children, at least once a year, being interested in her real feelings and not just formal phrases. But it wasn't like that, and it only got worse every year. She stood up and walked over to the window, looking out onto the street where people were hurrying about their business. She felt part of the world, but at the same time alienated from everything that was going on around her. This feeling of loneliness was unbearable, and every moment she spent in this emptiness became more and more painful. For a moment she thought of her children and how much time had gone into raising them, the sacrifices she had made so that they could achieve everything they had. Also they could be happy, so they could have everything she could ever dream of. But now she was alone, and it all seemed so empty to her. Was it even worth it? Slowly she sat down at the table where a cup of iced tea stood and looked at the phone screen again, hoping that maybe there would be a new call, but the screen remained blank, just like her life at this moment. She knew that her children had lives of their own, that they had their own worries, and she didn't want to be a burden to them. But did she ask for much? Just a little attention, a little warmth that she had once had in her life. She wasn't looking for her children to drop everything for her, she wasn't asking for much, just what was natural for any mother, to be heard, to be seen, to be needed. She glanced at the clock again, and her gaze grew even dimmer. Time dragged on slowly. It seemed to be dragging on purpose to make it harder for her to experience this moment of loneliness. The woman closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair, allowing herself some distraction from the pain that had been with her all along. Suddenly, another call rang out. The woman's heart skipped a couple beats. She grabbed the phone, but the screen showed her son's number again. An almost inaudible prayer escaped her lips, "Please let him say he's coming at least this time." The woman picked up the phone, waiting hopefully for a few seconds. But her "hello" was answered again with a soulless message. "Hi, Mom. We congratulate you. I'll be late tonight, I'm working through the night. We'll cross paths sometime, don't worry." She felt her heart fill with disappointment again. It was business as usual, promises that everything would be fine, but in reality she was alone. She didn't want to blame him, she just wanted someone to be there for her on this day for once. But instead she had to carry this pain inside her over and over again. As if summarizing everything that had happened, she turned back to the window. Outside, the world continued to spin, but inside there was only silence and the pain of her family becoming too distant, too foreign. The woman returned to her chair, her shoulders bent under the weight of the sensation, but she couldn't cry. She was too tired of this loneliness to even cry. She just sat in silence, waiting for something that never came. The day continued to drag on. Evening had already fallen outside the windows, the street seemed to fill with the last shadows, and the house was inexpressibly silent despite the bright day. The woman sat in an old armchair, nervously shifting her gaze from one corner of the room to another, as if trying to find some comforting detail in her surroundings. There was no joy inside. Even the air around her felt heavy, as if there hadn't been a living person or any excitement in the room in a long time. Everything was so still, you'd think time had simply stood still. She thought about the fact that her children had to come. They had always known it would be her birthday, she had always reminded them of the date, and she had always expected at least one of them to call on that day, to say a few words, or perhaps show up with a present, as she had in the past. But this time, like the last few years, no one showed up. That was essentially how her day ended. The time she had spent waiting was heavy and agonizing, and the feeling of abandonment deepened with each passing hour. But then, at some point, when hope was almost gone, there was a knock at the door. The woman rose from her chair and stirred, feeling her heart quicken its rhythm a little. She walked to the door with quiet steps, and when she opened it, she saw her niece in front of her, a young girl with big eyes and a soft smile. In her hand she held a small box wrapped in brightly colored paper. "Auntie, I wish you a happy birthday," the niece said, holding out the gift. "I know you must be missing the festivities, so I thought I'd stop by." The woman looked at the gift confusedly, and a faint spark of gratitude flickered in her eyes. It wasn't what she'd been expecting, but a faint hope still flickered in her heart, as if she'd suddenly received a piece of attention, even if not from the people she'd been expecting. "Oh, thank you, dear. You're so kind," the woman said, holding back the slight tremor in her voice. The niece entered the house and the woman returned to her chair, looking at the small box in the girl's hands. It was strange just one person had come, and it was not the one she needed so much. But it felt a little warmer in her heart. Her niece sat down next to her, and for a while there was silence in the room. The woman looked up at her guest, and noticing the caring expression on her face, felt that this might be the little comfort she had been waiting for. "Have you come alone? Where is your mother?" the woman asked, trying to get the conversation back on track. "Yes, my mom stayed home. She couldn't come, but I decided to come for her. She said hello, she loves you, she's just busy," the niece replied, her voice soft and light, but there was something wary in it, as if she was trying to guess what her aunt wanted to hear. The woman nodded, not knowing what to say in response. Of course, she knew that her niece didn't have the same connection to her children that she herself had with her children, but still she felt that something in that answer wasn't quite sincere. Why not come as a family, why not take at least a small step towards it? After all, this was her day. "I was so looking forward to it," she whispered quietly, not finishing the sentence. She didn't want to burden her niece with her worries, but there was such bitterness in her voice that the girl, seeing her gaze, felt her heart squeeze. It was not her place to comfort her aunt, but at this moment she was the one person who could bring a little relief. Her niece was silent, she didn't know what to say, and probably couldn't find the right words that could in any way overshadow the pain that was in the woman's soul. In the end, she just gently placed a hand on her shoulder, not trying to justify anyone's actions, but just being there for her. That silent presence was the whole point. Several minutes passed before the woman took the gift in her hands. Opening it, she saw a box with a beautiful bracelet. It wasn't the gift she had dreamed of, but for a moment, gratitude awoke in her soul, because the gesture was sincere and there was a lot of warmth in it. The woman took out the bracelet and carefully tried it on her wrist. "It's so beautiful." "Thank you," her voice could hardly be loud, but there was so much emotion in it that her niece felt her eyes begin to fill with tears. "Auntie, I'm so sorry that she couldn't continue." Seeing her emotions, the niece felt her own heart breaking at the fact that she may not have been able to give the love she could have given. In that moment, the woman finally realized that she was not alone, that at least someone remembered her birthday, even if not in the way she had expected. But amidst this sudden visit, the pain did not disappear, it only receded a little into a corner of her soul, as if for a moment there was an illusion of warmth and care. Those moments, however, were fleeting. "I'm glad you came. Please don't leave so soon," the woman said, feeling her heart tugging at every word. This moment was important to her. After all, her niece was the only person who had come, the only one who had in any way brightened the day. "Of course, Auntie, I'll stay. Let's just spend some time together," the niece replied, feeling that this small comfort was so important and necessary for her aunt. They sat in silence, and the woman felt her soul slowly fill with light, albeit faint, but light nonetheless. It was a temporary relief, a small spark of joy that would light up her day, but its brightness still dimmed against the pain that was inside. With each moment spent with her niece, the woman felt her loneliness recede a little, but there was still an unhealed wound in her heart from the fact that her children were so far away. The silence in the room was oppressive. The woman sat in her chair with her head down, and there was something invisible, heavy in her eyes. The room had an odor of old wood and dust, as if time had frozen here. All she could hear was the sound of her own breathing, slow and tired. She picked up the cup of tea, but, feeling neither the taste nor the warmth, set it back on the table. Thoughts began to muddle through her head, and every memory, every thought seemed like a heavy weight. How things have changed, she thought, looking back at the pictures on the walls again. Those smiles, those children who had once delighted her with their successes and simple joys, were so alien now. They had become distant, as if time had taken them to another world and she remained on the shore, looking at them but not having the strength to reach. The children she had raised with love and hope were adults now, but they didn't notice her. Or maybe they just didn't want to notice. Her oldest son, with whom she had endured so much, given so much. He had become successful, busy, and now his life was completely foreign to her. He called, but always on business. He sent congratulations, but via text message, as if those years of love and caring hadn't happened between them. She remembered how he used to ask her to tell her a bedtime story when she was little, how he used to bring her flowers with a smile on his face when he had just learned to walk. And now his worries were only about his career, his business, a world in which she had no place. "Daughter." The woman remembered how she had once been everything to her. How they had decorated the house together, how she had taught her to sew, how the girl had worried about every detail, every movement. And now she was far away. Work, friends, traveling, all of it was more important than those little moments when they could just talk, hold each other. She remembered her genuine smile as a child, but now all she saw was the cold mask of a successful woman who was too busy to pay attention to those who loved her most. And the youngest son. He was the hardest to deal with. She gave him everything she could, she supported him, did everything she could to make sure he had a future. He grew up with ambition, and she was proud of his success. But every year it became harder and harder to get through to him. He became more and more selfish, and it seemed like the whole world was centered only around his business. She couldn't understand how it was that the boy who had once run to her on his knees was now bypassing her with silence. Mentally, she replayed it all over and over again. How they had changed. How her children, who had once been such a source of joy, were now strangers. She felt an emptiness clench in her chest and pain crept into her heart. What has happened to us? Why are we so far apart? She thought. Every day it became more and more obvious that her children didn't notice her sacrifice, her love. They didn't notice how she waited for their calls, how worried she was every time they promised to come and then didn't. They didn't notice her loneliness, her pain, her need for simple human relationships. They were busy with their lives, their own affairs, and seemed to forget that she was part of that life. Her bitterness was growing into despair. The woman sat in the chair and thought about how to stop this process, how to bring it all back. How to get her children back, how to get back the love and care she once had in her family. She tried to find answers, but each time her thoughts came to the same thing: her children had become too busy, too far away from her. And all she could do was accept it. But she couldn't accept it. She couldn't sit and wait any longer. She couldn't continue to be in the shadows of their lives, watching them forget her. A thought was born in her heart: what if she showed them how important it was to be around family? What if she made them realize that what matters most is not success and money, but the bond that binds them together, the love and support of each other? This was her last chance. She couldn't let them continue down this path, ignoring her. She decided to make a move. She decided to go to extreme measures to make them finally realize that what mattered most was their family. She began to construct a plan that would be so drastic and unexpected that it would leave them no choice but to return to her, to their roots, to the values she had tried to instill in them since they were children. Her plan was simple. She decided to fake her own death. Yes, it was a risky move, but in her opinion, it was the only way to make them stop and think. She had to disappear so they would experience what it meant to lose someone you loved. She knew it would be a shock, that they would be devastated, but that was her goal: to make them realize how much they meant to her, and how important it was to be there for her in times of need. She couldn't take the loneliness anymore. She couldn't be the person everyone ignored anymore. She believed that if they faced real loss, they would realize that only family could be a pillar in life, that only family members could support each other, not wealth and status. She began to make a detailed plan. She decided that first she needed to make her disappearance seem real. She left a will that would reflect her last wish: that her children would learn the value of family, that they would realize that what matters is not how much money you have, but how you love and support your loved ones. In this will, she planned to provide trials for each of them that were meant to open their eyes. She wanted them to go through hardships, to experience the very simple things she had once experienced for them. Maybe I'm acting wrong, she thought, but her heart told her there was no other way. She couldn't just sit back and watch her children lose everything she had tried to give them. She knew her plan would be painful for everyone, but she believed it was the only way she could get them back. I have to do this, she thought, gaining determination. The woman finally felt her inner pain recede a little. She was no longer just an observer in her life. She had regained control again. The woman sat in her chair, in a room where everything was still and quiet. A tense silence hung in the air, as if the room itself was waiting for something important, almost inevitable. In her hands was the last document, her will. She signed it, rereading every word several times, certain that it was the right thing to do. Her children couldn't continue to live in their selfishness, ignoring the most important things in life. She knew they were too absorbed in their own affairs, too busy to think about real values. And if only they would realize what really mattered, maybe they would come back to her, to the relationship that had once been real. She glanced once more at her phone, which had received no messages, no calls. There was no doubt anymore. She was doing this for them, to make them realize the importance of family, love and togetherness. This was her last chance to win them back. She had left all the necessary instructions for her disappearance. It wasn't an easy decision, but she was sure she had to do it. It was the way it had to be done. Her death was fake, of course. But she hoped that her children, hearing about it, might reconsider their relationships, their lives, at least a little. She knew it would be a shock, that it would be a big blow to them, but maybe that was the moment they would feel how much they had lost her. And that was the point, to show them that without her presence, their lives, seemingly successful, would not be complete. Everything they did, all their accomplishments, were meaningless without their loved ones, without their family. On the evening of the day she signed the will, she called her lawyer. He was one of the few people who knew about her plan. He was a trusted man who had helped her family with legal matters in the past. She explained to him the details of her plan, how she wanted everything organized. The attorney, although surprised by her decision, agreed to help, knowing it would be important to her. 2 days later, when she had arranged everything she could, she walked into the house she had always felt cozy in, but now the place was a reminder of her loneliness. She felt no fear, only determination. It was all done. She didn't do it to scare her children, but to make them ask themselves the important question, what have we lost? She put the finishing touch on her plan by preparing in advance a fake letter to be discovered in her room. This letter was to confirm her death, to make her passing more real so that no one would doubt it. Several days passed, and the moment came when her children learned of her death. She couldn't see their reaction, but she could imagine what it would be like. At first they would probably be in shock. They would feel pain and loss, but soon that pain would have to turn into something more, the realization that their lives had changed. Maybe it will make them think that everything they've accomplished is meaningless without the one who was important to them in the beginning, without her love, without her care. As expected, the news of her death shocked them all. The first to react was the eldest son. He was in his office, absorbed in his work as always, when his assistant brought him a letter. He read it and his face immediately changed. He couldn't believe it had happened. He knew his mother had been sick, that her life had not been easy, but he never thought it would end like this. He immediately called his sister. "Mom. Mom's dead," he told her with panic in his voice, but at the same time something in his voice sounded detached. He didn't realize what he had really lost and was too focused on the questions that involved money, property, and what would happen next. What would he do with her inheritance now? That was more important than realizing the loss. His sister was in shock, as was he, but her first thought was not to come home. She, too, was focused on business. Their mother was gone, but her inheritance was something that had to be dealt with first. And once they came to the point that all obligations and inheritance issues needed to be resolved, the oldest son started calling his lawyer. The same scenario unfolded with the younger son. He, although more emotional than his older brothers, still focused on what could be gained from this. It didn't matter that she was gone. What mattered to him was how he could get his share and what he should do about it now. He reckoned there was plenty of time, and he did not go home at once, but went on with his work, planning how to get it right and secure himself. The woman, in her hiding place, watched all the events, but did not interfere. She was prepared for this. Her children's shock was only part of the plan. Now they would face the fact that their mother was gone, and that all they had accomplished could not replace what they had lost. But she was sure it would be enough to make them think about what was important in life. Time passed, and the children's response was not what she had hoped for. Instead of focusing on family values, on the importance of their bond, they started fighting over what was left behind. All the conversations between them centered on inheritance, on shares, on who would get what. They began to discuss details of property, bank accounts, houses and land, forgetting that behind it all was the man who had created it all. The woman felt hurt that they still didn't get the main point. She sat in the shadows and watched it. She knew it was something they needed to get over. And yet it still hurt. It hurt to see how her children, with whom she had once dreamed of a happy future, were now fixated on material things. It was confirmation that she had been right in her decision. Only through this shock could they realize what was really important. A few days passed and the so-called funeral became a widely discussed event in their lives. News of their mother's death spread quickly, and her children, even though they were in distant corners of the world, immediately felt the need to attend to matters that were more familiar to them than attending to their feelings or emotions. They were consumed with paperwork, legal matters, and even, paradoxical as it may sound, the division of her inheritance. When the oldest son, who was in New York, finally came home, he was surrounded by attorneys and lawyers to help him settle things. He started working on selling her house, transferring all her assets into his name. He felt a little guilty, but his thoughts were increasingly focused on how to profitably dispose of this inheritance. He didn't know what to do with her records, her favorite things, her letters and photographs. Time passed and he thought less and less about his mother, her life and her experiences. His sister, who lived in Paris, did not immediately return home. She was in a very different situation. Her life was too full of social gatherings, career and the need to maintain her image. The news of her mother's death shook her, but like her brother, she quickly focused on more practical things. She took part in the negotiations for the house, decided how to distribute the property, but the emotions and feelings of her mother's passing remained somewhere far behind her. She barely had time to stop to think about what was behind it. The younger son, though a bit more emotional than his older siblings, also took no time to grieve. He was consumed with work, dealing with the company that brought him money, and never gave serious thought to the ties that bound him to his mother. He felt responsible for his life and successes, but now, after her death, instead of thinking about how he could change his life and his relationship with his mother, he was more concerned with how to secure his future. He only had time to return home for a few days, and like everyone else, focused on business, forgetting what they had actually lost. For the woman watching from afar, it was painful. She didn't expect her children to immediately react the way she expected them to. The shock of her death did not cause them to think deeply about the family ties, the love and support she had hoped they would once again realize. Instead, they absorbed her inheritance as if her life didn't matter, as if everything she had done was nothing more than just an intermediate step in their journey to success. These thoughts did not stop with the woman. She tried to find solace in her own decisions, but was frustrated by the way her children perceived what was happening. In the evening, after all the papers were signed and the inheritance issues were resolved, they gathered at her old house. All three, each with their own thoughts and concerns, were ready to spend their last days in the house before finalizing all the procedures and selling the property. There was none of the expected compassion and grief. On the contrary, the house seemed even emptier than before. The children were sitting in a room discussing how best to sell the property, who would handle the sale, who would take care of reissuing all the paperwork. The woman watching all this felt her hope dying completely. She no longer believed that her children would realize that what mattered most was not money and things, but relationships. In their eyes, she was just a part of their journey, a part of the inheritance they had to distribute properly. She tried to find in their faces even the slightest memory of who she was to them, but she couldn't find it. At that moment, the woman realized that her decision, though drastic, was inevitable. She tried to understand why this had happened. Why her children had become such strangers. Maybe it was her fault? Maybe she'd missed something, failed to create something that would keep them together? But then she realized, it wasn't her fault. They had changed, and the process was inevitable. All that was left was to accept it. Despite her pain, she felt that this moment was important. The shock and confusion of her children showed her that they were experiencing a loss after all. Yes, they hadn't gotten back to her, hadn't realized what she was trying to tell them, but this situation, this experience, would probably lead them to important conclusions. They will reflect for a long time on what happened. Perhaps after time, they will realize that she did not do it to punish them, but to make them learn again to appreciate what is really important. Several months had passed since the day her children learned of her fake death. The woman had been watching their lives from afar, hiding in her quiet, secluded apartment, away from their eyes. She was ready to meet them, ready to see them again. Each of her children had experienced this period in their own way, and although her disappearance had left them in great shock, they had soon returned to the lifestyle they were accustomed to, with only a few changes that she hoped could be the beginning of change. The time had come. She decided that she would meet them one by one so that each of them could experience this meeting alone with her, so that she could see that they realized how important family relationships were. She didn't know if they would be able to change their lives, but deep down she believed that this experience would change them. Her plan was working, and now it all depended on how they would take her return. Her oldest son arrived first. He was the first to know the truth. The woman stood at the window and watched his car pull up to the house. There was a mixture of surprise, fear, and guilt in his eyes. He didn't know his mother was alive, and for a moment he paused at the door as if hesitant to enter. She took a step toward him. "Mother, are you alive?" His voice shook, he didn't know what to think. It was the moment he realized that she was actually willing to take such drastic measures to make him understand something. The woman didn't answer right away. She just stood there looking at him, letting him feel the gravity of the moment. He walked quickly into the house and sat down on the couch, nervously adjusting his suit. I don't understand how you could, he began, but his voice faded. He was silent for a moment, as if trying to comprehend what was happening. I couldn't even imagine that you would do this. Why did you choose to do this to us? Why didn't you just ask to talk like normal people? She looked at him and answered sadly. I tried to talk to you, but you couldn't hear me. I was just part of the background to you, part of your world that you could just forget when it wasn't convenient. I tried to be a part of your life, but you started to ignore me. And so, to make you hear me, I took this step. He didn't know what to say. He was silent, and her words seemed to hit him right in the heart. He had long since forgotten how important it was to communicate, how important it was to be around loved ones. He was just beginning to realize what he had lost, and that not everything in life could be measured by money and status. The life that seemed successful to him was empty without that connection to his family. He looked at her with regret and understanding. I didn't realize you were so worried. His voice was quiet. I didn't think it was important to you that I didn't call. I thought you understood everything, that I was a busy man. She sighed softly and replied. I realize you're busy, but what's more important? Family or a career that has no meaning without those you care about? You gave your all to your work, but it didn't fill the space that family should have. He sighed, realizing she was right. It was the first time he'd met her, but her words were already leaving a deep imprint on his soul. He realized he needed to make a change, needed to learn to appreciate what he had and not lose the moments he had ignored for so long. A few days later, his sister arrived. She didn't arrive as confidently as he did, with a noticeable anxiety in her eyes. Her life was consumed with career, social events, and the constant race for success, but despite all her accomplishments, she felt an inner emptiness that was hard to ignore. She didn't enter the house right away, standing at the door with her hands slightly clasped together as if she was worried that she would be the one to be greeted by her mother. The woman was ready for the meeting, but she was in no hurry. She knew her daughter would be looking for excuses, trying to explain why her life had turned out the way it had. Mom, I didn't know you felt this way. Her daughter's words were full of embarrassment. She hadn't expected this turn of events. She had always believed that work and status were more important than anything else, and she thought her mother understood all that. But now that she saw her, alive and real, she felt that something in her life had gone wrong. The woman smiled quietly, though her face was still filled with sadness. Did you think I could understand your lifestyle? I never asked you to be like this. I only asked for one thing, to be there for me when I needed you, to support me when I needed you. The daughter sat beside me and was silent. She realized that her life wasn't as full as she thought it was. All her successes, all her parties, all her ambitions were empty if she didn't have someone close to her. She felt guilty, and in that moment she had a desire to change things. I promise that I will try to change my priorities, Mom. I don't want to pretend anymore that I'm living a life that I don't want. I want you and me to be closer. Mother nodded silently, feeling relieved. It was an important admission, and she knew it was the beginning of change. It couldn't change everything in one meeting, but she hoped that this step would be the first step toward restoring the bond she'd waited so long for. The younger son arrived a few days later. He was more emotional than his older brothers, but his reactions were no less interesting. He was reliving his fall, his struggle to succeed and what he thought were lost opportunities. But meeting his mother made him look at his life differently. Mom, did you really do this for us? His voice was full of doubt and bewilderment. He didn't know how to react to her return. But he also realized that now he had to figure out what was really important. His life was full of accomplishments and successes, but an inner sense of emptiness never left him. She looked at him understandingly, but without reproach. You thought success was all that mattered. You've forgotten for too long that love and caring is what gives meaning to all those accomplishments. You've tried to fill the void with money instead of what really matters. He was silent, and the moment was a revelation to him. He realized that he had lost something important that he couldn't get back with just money or status. I'll try to be better, Mom. I don't want to lose anything else that really matters. I'll be there for you when you need my help." At that moment, the woman felt relieved, but also sad. She couldn't get back everything that had been lost, but she believed that her children understood the importance of connection, the importance of family and love. Thus, seeing each of her children was a small step towards rebuilding a relationship. The woman knew it was only the beginning, but at least they were beginning to realize that it was important to be close, that family was more than just relatives, it was support that gave them the strength to go on. After each of the children finally met their mother, the shock of her death began to subside little by little. They began to realize that she was still around, that her disappearance was not something temporary, but the result of her decisive move. All those months of thinking they had lost her were now cause for much reflection. But the questions did not disappear. On the contrary, they became more and more painful. Why had she done this? Why couldn't she just say how she felt? Why did she need to cause such drama when she could just talk? With each day they spent with their mother, the children realized more and more that what she had done was not just an attempt to get attention. It was a serious attempt to change their lives, to bring them back to a point where family ties mattered. But none of them were prepared for what would follow afterward. The woman sat in the chair and watched carefully the reactions of each of the children. Each of them was experiencing it in their own way. The older son, as if he had never been shocked, tried to justify her actions, trying to find a rational explanation for her action. The daughter was more emotional, she kept wondering why her mother couldn't just talk to them instead of taking it to such extremes. The younger son, on the other hand, was depressed. He felt guilty for not understanding his mother sooner, but he couldn't escape his inner conflict here either. He had a hard time accepting the fact that her act overshadowed all of his own successes. This was the moment when they all had to come together to discuss what had happened and to understand each other. Mother knew that that time had come. She prepared herself for a conversation that she knew would be hard, but necessary. She had to tell what was behind what she had done. She had to explain why she did what she did. They gathered in the very house where so many years of their childhood had passed. All three children sat across from her. The usual things, a cup of tea, a peaceful atmosphere seemed calm at first glance, but tension hung in the air. The very moment of truth they had all been avoiding for so long. It was the daughter who spoke first. She couldn't hide her displeasure. "Mom, I understand all this, but can't you just say it? Why did you decide to go this way? Why did everything have to be so dramatic? You see how busy I am. I've been going through a rough patch, and I just haven't had the time. I realize you wanted to wake us up, but we didn't expect you to go this far." The daughter's words were full of irritation and resentment. She was disappointed that her mother didn't try to understand her life. The path she had chosen to bring her family back seemed excessive, illogical. Her mother listened silently, realizing how hard it would be for anyone to understand her choices. But her goal was not to make excuses. She knew her actions would be perceived as aggressive, but she believed they would help them see the important things in life. "I tried to explain that I needed to feel that I was important to you. That you remembered me, that I wasn't just part of your background. I can't keep quiet and wait any longer. I can't be the person who remains in the shadow of your successes," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but there was sadness and weariness in it. Her words touched everyone. The son, the eldest, with whom his mother had always shared the strongest bond, now seemed distant. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window as if he didn't know what to say. "You can't just expect us all to give up our lives for you. We're all adults, and we all have our own problems, our own goals. You couldn't understand that it's not that simple. We could have helped, but you turned a blind eye to what was going on around us." Her son said this with a tone that conveyed that he had a hard time accepting her words. He continued. "We're all with you, but all of this, your actions, your death, it's all too much for us. Couldn't you just talk?" She noticed how his gaze was full of resentment. His words sounded like an accusation, but she understood, he didn't know how to express his feelings properly. He, like the rest of them, was too entangled in his own world. But now he, like everyone else, needed to understand the importance of this moment. "I tried, but you didn't hear me," she replied. "I tried to explain, but you all continued to live by your own rules. I could no longer sit in the shadows." Now all three children sat in silence. Each was going through a different experience. The daughter was confused, the oldest son felt guilty, and the youngest just didn't know how to be. This moment of revelation was a real shock for each of them. But even in that silence, there was progress. They began to realize that their mother was willing to take these extreme measures, not because of anger or revenge, but because of the pain and loneliness she was feeling. Now they had to understand her, and learn to be there for her. Several weeks passed after they all came together and met their mother. Each of them faced the difficult challenge of not only realizing what they had lost, but also realizing how important it was to be considerate of those around them, how important it was to appreciate those who had always been there for them. The woman knew that her children were going through this process in different ways, but now it was time for real change. The eldest son, like his mother, was a man who was ambitious and focused on his career. His entire focus was on work, on numbers, on deals, and on success. But his recent encounter with his mother made him look at his life differently. He realized that material possessions and career achievements are not all there is to life. He became more considerate of those around him. For the first time in years, he wanted to be a real person, not just a successful businessman. The first steps to change: he started small. He started spending more time with the people who worked with him in the company. He started caring, listening to their problems, helping them in difficult situations. In the first days, he felt uncomfortable. He didn't know how to communicate with people in a real way, not through the prism of business. But, gradually, he began to realize that it didn't really matter how much money he had in his account. It was important that his work was not only profitable, but also meaningful to the people he worked with. He began to support his colleagues' initiatives, help them solve personal problems, share his experience and knowledge. And this was a real step towards change, towards real leadership, not through control, but through care and attention. My daughter, after all the experiences and emotions she went through, also began to perceive her life differently. Her desire for success and external recognition now took a back seat. Instead of running around to social events and building a career, she began to think about the deeper meaning of life. She began to help those in need, supporting charitable projects, working with children in need of care, and actively engaging in social initiatives. Her focus became not on how to make her own life more successful, but on how to make other people's lives a little easier. She realized that her own success didn't matter if she didn't have people around her that she could help. She organized several charity events that raised money for orphanages and homeless shelters. Instead of wasting her time partying, she decided to dedicate her efforts to a cause that could change someone's life. While working with children, she realized how much attention and care can mean. Small steps, such as simply spending time with a child, supporting them, or helping them through a difficult situation, were much more fulfilling than any social dinners or celebrity sightings. The youngest son finally realized that not everything in life is measured only by money and success. He was a man who always put his career and his own well-being first, ignoring everything else. After the death of his mother, when he had to reflect on his own mistakes, he began to change. He realized that life was too short to spend it chasing wealth and that what mattered most was relationships with people, especially those close to him. He started spending more time with family and friends, helping those who needed support. He also noticed that there were a lot of people around him who lacked basic attention, and that if he could help, it was more important than all his financial success. He began volunteering at a homeless shelter, helping kids who had learning disabilities, and spending time with those who just needed companionship. He also began helping his mother with her charity projects, doing so not as an obligation but as a conscious choice. This was his personal contribution to changing his life and the lives of those around him. Each of the children went through a transformation after going through the ordeal. They began to appreciate those around them more and realized how important it was to care for others. It was not a quick process, but they all began to realize that family is not just a blood bond, but a support that is important to give and receive. Thanks to the mother who went to extreme lengths to get them to think, they began to change. The woman, watching their progress, was relieved. She didn't expect things to change all at once. But she believed that her children were on the right track, that this experience would open their eyes to what was really important in life. Now, after everything, they began to help those who were in difficult situations, they began to show attention to the needs of others and, most importantly, they began to realize what it meant to be truly close to each other. A family that once seemed lost was now on the road to recovery. The woman felt that her plan had worked. Change, though not perfect, was beginning to happen. Her children now knew that it was important to give as well as receive, that the real value of life was in helping others and being there for those who needed support. It had been several months since her children began to change. The woman could see them trying to figure out what was really important and how they were trying to be better. However, there was a growing feeling inside her that it was time to reveal the whole truth to them. That moment when they could be a family again, when they would understand her true motive, was inevitable. The woman prepared herself to talk to her children. She didn't know how they would take her revelation. Realizing that her fake death was the final step toward their inner change brought her both relief and anxiety. Now they were more attentive, more caring, beginning to realize the importance of close and simple human relationships, but she still wasn't entirely sure they could understand her act, even with all the changes. Her decision had been made. She had decided that their family should unite definitively. Only now that each of them had become more considerate and open could the whole truth be told and a new phase begin. The woman felt that if she didn't do it now, she would never see her family as it should be. She knew this conversation would be difficult but important. With each passing day, her confidence in her choice only grew. The day she invited them all to the meeting, her heart beat faster than usual. The eldest son was the first to arrive. He walked into the house with slight disbelief, as if he expected to hear something important. His eyes were tired, but they no longer held the same aloofness. He felt that something had to change, that it was time to deal with the feelings and problems they had ignored for so long. His daughter arrived an hour later. She was in a good mood, but you could tell by the look in her eyes that she suspected something. It didn't take long for the youngest son to arrive. He was the most sensitive of all, and his eyes immediately met his mother's with expectation. Gathering all together, they sat around the table, looking at each other in silence. The woman felt the tension in the room rise. Her children were ready to hear something important, but she didn't know exactly how to approach the conversation. "I didn't invite you here just to talk about what happened," she began, her voice calm but determined. "You've all changed. I can see that, and I'm proud of you. But there's something else I have to tell you. And it's something I've been keeping from you." She paused to give each of them a chance to set up for a serious conversation. The words she was about to utter could be the last step in their reconciliation or, conversely, the final breakup. But she was no longer afraid. She knew that, regardless of the reaction, they were now ready for it. "I'm not dead," her words came out quietly, but with great clarity. "I have been alive all this time. I orchestrated all of this so that you would realize how important your relationship is to me, how important it is to be there for you, not to be forgotten. It was my final decision." She saw her children freeze, their faces pale with shock. Each of them was stunned. The reactions varied. The eldest son was the first to come to his senses. You've been playing with us all this time?" His voice was full of bewilderment and anger. Why didn't you tell us directly? We would have come, we would have helped, we would have been there for you." She remained silent, giving him time to realize the full extent of what had happened. This was a moment when she needed to not make excuses, but to give them a chance to sort out their feelings. Her daughter, sitting across from her, looked at her mother with some mixture of anger and pain. "Mom, that was too much. You can't just do this to us. We lost you. You made us think you were gone. We thought we had to grieve. Couldn't you just talk to us? Why did it have to be so complicated? Why did it have to be so far away?" The youngest son didn't say a word. He just sat there looking at his mother with a look that could have been full of resentment, but at the same time there was some understanding in his eyes. He felt that her actions were motivated by love, but he didn't know how to accept it. The woman replied calmly, with complete confidence that she was right. I tried to speak, but you couldn't hear me. I couldn't just sit back and watch my children lose touch with each other anymore. I didn't do it out of anger, but out of pain, because I could no longer be invisible to you. You were consumed with your lives, and I decided that if I didn't do this, I could never make you realize how important it was to be there for you. It wasn't easy. But I believe it was necessary for you to finally realize that we can't live alone, that family is what brings us together, not what destroys us. The silence that reigned in the room was heavy. It felt like something unbearably tense. Each of the children experienced the moment differently. But gradually, with each word she spoke, they began to realize her motives. Lights of understanding lit up in their eyes. The youngest son finally said, Mom, I understand. I didn't know how you were feeling. We were all so busy doing our own thing that we forgot what was really important. You did it for us. I think we have to make a fresh start now. The eldest son was silent, but his gaze grew softer. He looked at his mother with understanding, and his anger began to dissipate. You might be right. But you could have just told us. We would have realized on our own that we needed to be there for each other, that we couldn't go on like this. The daughter was silent, too. She couldn't forgive right away, but her heart wasn't so hard anymore. She couldn't just forget what had happened, but she gradually began to realize that her mother hadn't done it to punish them, but to make them realize how much they meant to each other. The mother stood up and walked over to each of the children, hugging them in turn. They hadn't expected this. She didn't ask for forgiveness, but her gesture was wordlessly clear. It was the forgiveness without words, the forgiveness they had all been waiting for. Let's start again. We will be there for each other. We will support each other. And I'm sure that together we can get through whatever lies ahead, she said, and her words were sincere. At that moment, something changed in their relationship. They realized that family bonds are not just words, but actions that need to be upheld. They made a decision to start a new phase of life, with new priorities. They now knew that the most important thing was to be there for each other, to support each other and to never forget that family was their foundation. The family was on the threshold of a new phase of their lives. After all the trials, the fighting, and the secrets revealed, they had finally found their way to an understanding. Those weeks of each of them going through their transformation were now the basis for building anew the foundation on which they could be real to each other. The woman who had once felt neglected and rejected now felt that her children had changed, they had become more attentive, they had learned to appreciate not only material goods, but the support that was most important. There was a warm atmosphere and peaceful tranquility in the house again. They now spent time together, genuinely enjoying each other's company. There was no more tension, no more conflict. Each of the family members realized that the most important thing in life is not money, not status, but relationships. They realized that the most important thing was support, love, and shared well-being. Those moments that once seemed insignificant now became the most precious. The eldest son, who had once been consumed by his career, now devoted more time to his family. He spent evenings talking with his mother, helping her around the house, and weekends were now more often spent in the company of his sister and brother. He realized that his success in business was meaningless without real, sincere relationships. Every day he realized how much he had lost by not paying attention to his loved ones, and now, trying to fix it, he was beginning to be a real leader, not only at work, but also in the family. The daughter, who once sought recognition in society, now found true fulfillment in doing good. She helped organize charity events, volunteer projects, supported children from disadvantaged families and found much more joy in this than in any social gathering. Her outlook on life changed and she realized that how she could help others was far more important than how she was perceived by others. Instead of chasing fashion and status, she now cared about those who truly needed help. Her younger son, who had always been consumed with his own ambitions and personal achievements, was now much more considerate of people. He began to realize that life is not only about striving for success, but also about being able to support loved ones, help those around him, and create something meaningful for others. He became actively involved in his mother's life, became her support, not just a spectator, and this brought him inner satisfaction. Each of them, step by step, learned to be considerate, sincere, and ready to give. All three children began to realize that material achievements are not the only thing that should define their lives. A life filled with attention, care and love for their neighbors, that is what now became their main guideline. They began to spend a lot of time together. Instead of scattering to social events or being consumed by work, the family often had dinners together, outings into nature, quiet evenings playing board games or talking. These moments became a real value to them. They stopped looking at life as a race for wealth and prestige. The most important thing for them was no longer what they had, but with whom they could share their joys and experiences. Mother, watching all this, felt proud and calm. All her efforts, her sacrifices, her radical actions, which at first seemed too cruel, now justified themselves. She saw her children changing, becoming more sensitive, more attentive to others. This was the result she had been striving for, and now she could safely watch the family become truly united. The woman did not hide her satisfaction. She saw how her children were trying to be close, how they were realizing the value of family and human relationships. She knew that her task was accomplished. And despite all the difficulties, she was happy. Their family had been through a tough time, but now they were ready to start a new phase, a phase of life with different priorities, with new views of the world. One evening, when the whole family gathered around the table, the woman raised a toast. "I am proud of you. I am proud of the way you have changed, the way you have become more attentive to those around you. We have all been through many difficult moments, but now we can move forward without forgetting that the most important thing is to support each other. Let's not lose this connection, let's be there for each other, not only in good times, but also in hard times." The children, smiling and nodding, raised their glasses. They realized that their lives would be different now. They were no longer people who chased success and signs of wealth. They had become those who sought true happiness in relationships, in support, in love. From that day forward, their lives truly changed. Instead of focusing only on accomplishments, they began to appreciate every moment they spent together. Instead of being on the lookout for external recognition, they learned to find joy in helping others, loving each other, and supporting those around them. The woman sat among her children, her heart at peace. She knew that they would no longer be lost in this world. She saw that they had found their way to true values. And although the journey had been long and full of challenges, they were now a family that had found true happiness, not in money and status, but in love and support. Thank you for walking this journey with the characters in this story. I hope this story about the power of family, forgiveness, and new beginnings has inspired you and reminded you of the importance of support and love even in the most difficult times. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave your impressions and comments. Your thoughts and feedback are very important and inspire new stories. Subscribe and give your like so you don't miss new stories. I apologize for any errors in the text. Thank you for your understanding and support.